Hello everyone, today we're going to go over an introduction to foliage materials. I realized that in previous tutorials we used the chestnut pack, and if we try to go into the materials itself, let me just open the master material. It can be a bit complicated to understand and see what's going on. So today we're going to create a simple material for our foliage and then one that's a bit more complex. And I'll be using these assets from the Landscape Pro pack, I believe it was. We used it in another tutorial. This is going to be the same mesh, and it's duplicated 2 times. This one has the materials that came with it by default. This one has a simple material that we will create, and this one has a bit more complex one. The first thing we want to check is what textures this mesh has. So we go into the material. This is the default material it has. It's using Pivot Painter for the wind instead of simple wind. And it has a color for the leaves, and it has a normal. It doesn't have a roughness map. So what we will be creating first is this one, the pine material. As you can see, it's really simple. To create a material, let me just go back to the folder. We're going to right click, create material, which is what I did here. I have a master material and then I have created 2 instances. The difference between a material and a material instance is that material instances allow you to change parameters in real time. So if I go to my asset and I open the material instance that I did for my leaves, let me just make this a bit more tiny, and I change the desaturation, you can see the changes in real time. Let's leave it by default, and let's go into the material to see how it's done. Before anything, selecting this, you go into the details panel, and you should note that foliage normally has a blend mode masked and it's 2-sided, so you need to take this too. I created also a duplicate of the textures that we're going to use, so we want to select them and simply drag them in. For the master material, I simply have some default textures here because it doesn't really matter. We will set the proper textures here in the material instance. So drag whatever textures you want. One will be the color and one will be the normal. To create parameters, which is what we are touching here, as you can see I have 3 groups created: color, texture and wind. The color parameters are the desaturation and the tint. The textures are the color and the normal, and the wind parameters are these ones. I won't go over the wind today, since I have a dedicated video on how to create simple wind, but I will go over how to create these. So if we have a texture sample and we want to convert it into a parameter so that we can change it later on in our material instances, we simply have to right click it and convert to parameter. Here we'll give it the name that we want, and here we either type a new group or we select from the ones that we already created. I'm gonna delete these since we already have them. For the color, we could simply plug it into the base color, but we want a bit more control. So we added a tint. To create a tint, we click 4 on our keyboard and then left click, and we create this. We're simply multiplying the color by a tint, and then we also used a desaturation node, and we're using a parameter to calculate what the desaturation should be. To create this, we can simply click 1 on our keyboard and then left click and then convert to parameter. For the tint also, if we click 4 on our keyboard and then click, We can then right click and convert to parameter and name it whatever you want. And don't forget to group it where you want. The normal will simply kind of plug in. Once you have your simple material created, we can go to our folder, and by right clicking and creating a material instance, you create material instances. Here I created two, one for the leaves and one for the trunk. I then went back to my landscape, back to the mesh, and assigned the correct instances to the slots. If I open the trunk, you will see that we also have our color, textures, and wind. The only difference between pine leaves and the trunk is the textures that we use. We haven't touched anything else. For the trunk, we do have to change one thing. Since in the pine material, the blend mode is set to masked, since it's normally what Foliage uses. For the trunk, since it is not using any opacity mask, we have to set it back to opaque. Something I forgot to mention was that since we're using masked, we need an opacity mask. If we go back to our textures and we go into our to the leaves color and we deselect certain channels, we'll see that the opacity mask is stored in the alpha channel of our color texture. This is not always the case, and some assets may have the alpha channel stored somewhere else. It might be in the roughness texture, or it might be in another texture completely. You'll have to, depending on the assets that you are using, you'll have to search for the opacity mask. A quick way to see where the opacity mask is stored is, if we go back, actually let's just use this one as an example. If we go to the default material and we want to go to the pine tree, we can see what is plugged in here. And if we continue this line, you'll see that it comes from the alpha channel of the color texture. That's one way to figure it out. Let me just close this and this. Another thing you may have realized is that we don't have a texture for the roughness. Some assets do have it, such as this one, for example. Now we go to the material of this one. You'll see that we have a color, a normal, and then a roughness texture that stores the ambient occlusion roughness and the metallic input. If we go to the textures, you'll see it has a color, normal, and a ambient occlusion. I believe it's red, then roughness would be green, and metallic is blue or something like this. It depends on the texture. But as you can see, for this one, they're using the red channel for the ambient occlusion, the green for the roughness, and the blue for the metallic. For our material, since it doesn't have a roughness texture, we're simply putting a default value of 1. Metallic 0, since we don't want it to be reflective, specular 0, and everything else left by default. The wind calculations, we simply plug into the world position offset, and that would be our simple material done, where we have our color that passes through a desaturation node and then it's multiplied by a tint, which is why these colors are a bit darker than the default ones. Then we have our alpha channel plugged into the opacity mask, and then we have our normal, and then our simple wind. We created 2 instances where the only changes we made was to replace the textures with the correct ones, and then for the pine trunk, apart from replacing the textures, we put this back to opaque. Now for the more complex one, we simply build upon this one, which is here. So for this one, I used reroute nodes, pine trunk here. Sorry. As you can see, the inputs for UVs in the simple one, we are not plugging anything into this. But for the complex one, we wanted to control the tiling of the textures, so we created this. Texture coordinates multiplied by tiling. This is a parameter that we created. To get this node, you simply type texture coordinate, and here it is. And then what I created is a reroute declaration node. I typed UV, and this allows us to use this input somewhere else without having to plug everything from a certain distance. It just helps keep things tidy. So let's go by parts. First we have the UVs, which are here. And we're using the UVs for our color, for our roughness, in case we had roughness, for our normal. Another thing I want to mention is the way the reason we say this as collapsed is because we have this set to true. If we didn't, we would see it like this, but since I'm already applying the color and everything to the make material attributes node, I decided it was just easier to use material attributes like this and then plug it directly in. This is not necessary at all. You could simply unpin this, put this as false, and plug this directly into the... But since I copied this from a previous project that I did where it was already done like this, I just left it by default. Okay, so we have our UVs to be able to control the tiling. Then we go to the color. We plug in our UV. From the color, we also add a desaturation node with our parameter created. We also wanted to be able to increase the power of the color, so we created a multiply and another parameter, and then a simple tint. Since I didn't want all my nodes to be connected at a distance, I created another reroute node here. So we simply drag, we type reroute, and we add a named reroute declaration node. I'm going to be using a lot of these throughout the project. We also created one for our alpha mask, so we don't have to plug this down here. So that's our color. Then the roughness. We don't have roughness, which is why I made a switch parameter. To make a switch parameter, simply type switch and select static switch parameter. Name it whatever you want, and again set the group to the one you want. In my case, the default value is false, so we will use a roughness of 0.9 normally. Again, if we did have a roughness texture, we would simply put it here and then set this to true. Since we don't have it, we're going to leave it to false, and we keep a roughness of 0.9. Then we have our normal, but this time we're making a series of calculations so we can increase the normal strength. Out from the RGB, we make a mask. We select the channels that we want to mask. In our case, it's going to be the red and the green channel. And we do another mask for the B channel. We multiply a parameter by the mask of red and green channels, and then we append to the blue channel, and that would be our normal output. And then we have the opacity. I'm gonna go later into this before I'll show you the material instances that we created. Then we have the wind intensity, and the only change I made here was to create a wind switch. Basically, so that we can disable the wind on certain materials. For example, in our tree, the leaves do need to have wind, but the trunk is not necessary. So what we did in the material instance, as you can see here, we already have more parameters. All the ones we created here. If we go to the pine trunk, we'll see that we have disabled the wind. Whereas with the pine leaves, we have it enabled. And as you can see, the options show. If we disable the wind, we no longer see the options. And something interesting I saw before is that if we go to our lit option and we go to optimization view modes and we go to shader complexity, you'll see the one that is actually better is this one here. This one is with the default material. This one is the simple material. The reason this one is a bit more complex than this one is because here we didn't add a switch for the wind. And although the trunk doesn't move because it's multiplied by the vertex colors, which I explain in the simple wind tutorial, we are still assessing if it should move. This one, the shader complexity is better since we disabled the wind on the trunk, which is here. And now I wanted to cover a problem that came up in one of the previous tutorials where Nanite meshes, such as these ones, I have Nanite enabled, the shadow of the Nanite mesh loses quality the further distance you are away from it. And one of the solutions, it doesn't really, you can't really appreciate it with this mesh. Let me just see if I can find the other one that I used. No, it was... Yeah, as you can see, the further I go, the less quality the shadow gets. And the solution I found for this, I think this is where we created the... yeah, if we increase the opacity, we no longer had that problem. So, what we created in this material right here for the opacity is that the opacity intensity will change depending on the distance from the camera to the pixel of the mesh. So just to explain this over, we're calculating the distance from the mesh to the camera. We're making it a smooth step. This means we're making or selecting two distances. One where the minimum intensity will be applied and one where the maximum intensity will be applied. The minimum distance will be 1000 and the maximum distance will be 3000. If we go back to our landscape and we get further away, you'll see that the leaves start to get a bit denser, especially compared to the one on the left. We will change the values so it's a bit more noticeable further on, but I just wanted to show you that. Let's go back to our master material. So here we would set the distances where we want the thing to change. Smooth step will simply take into account these distances and then output a value of 0 to 1. I added a saturate just because it clamps the value between 0 and 1, but this should do it anyway, so I think this is optional. And then based on this value, we're going to lerp between a lower opacity intensity and maximum opacity intensity. Then we simply multiply this by the alpha mask of our color, which is this one here. And that goes into our opacity mask. All these outputs are then plugged in with their correspondent name. So normal into normal, opacity mask into opacity mask, color, color, roughness. For metallic, specular, and ambient occlusion, I also made parameters just in case we want to change them further on in the material instance, but for now they have their default values. So let's just go back to our landscape, save everything, get our pine leaf instance, and let's just change some of the values so you can notice. So let's reduce our max distance. Actually, that's why it wasn't working. So if I go back now, you will notice that this one is a bit more dense than this one. Because the further back we go, the further into the more the opacity intensity increases. As you can see, if we get closer, the opacity slowly decreases. So this could be a solution to change the opacity based on the player's distance to the mesh. That way, the shadows would never look weird. Another application for this would be to combine it with the co-distances. So if we change these values and we, let's say 1000 here, 3000 here, and we want here to be 1 and here to be 0. And the effect we have is that as we go further away, the tree starts to disappear. We might want to apply that to avoid the popping effect that co-distances may have. So if you remember, in our foliage painting tool, we set co-distances. So at a distance of between 1000 and 3000, the grass might start to disappear. We could combine those distances with this thing that we made here to make the effect seem less sudden and make the mesh slowly disappear. This would work better with bushes and grass, since trees by default have an opaque material, which is the trunk, and that might not be exactly what you're looking for. But for small bushes and grass, this might be an effect that you are looking for. Before I go, I did want to show some of the options that the parameters that we made do. So let's go into our pine leaves, make it a bit smaller. We already talked about the opacity parameters that we created. Let's leave this by default, and then, for example, our color saturation we saw before, but the less the number is, the more saturation we'll get in our mesh. We can increase and decrease the power of the color to make it darker or brighter. We can also change the tint. Then we have our texture settings. We can increase the normal, occlusion, metallic, roughness, specular tiling. If we touch the tiling, everything will go off, but this might be a good option for the trunk. Let's just open that also. And go down here. There we go to our texture settings, tiling. We might want the tiling to be bigger or smaller, depending on what you're going for. And this number is what we can use it for. Let's leave this by default. Let's go back to the leaves. Specular. I think specular increases the amount of light that is reflected, if I remember correctly. Roughness, let's see. Yeah, it makes it look smoother. Let's set it back to what it was. Metallic will simply give it a metallic look to it. Ambient occlusion. Not sure if there's much of a difference with that one. Normal strength. Increases the contrast. Textures are the textures. We don't have a roughness texture, so we didn't enable it. And then our wind parameters. Okay, I think that's everything now. And I think we more or less covered everything. As you can see, it's really simple to make. You can have more control with the parameters that you set, and you don't need that much of a complex material to get something that looks good. Hopefully you learned something. I hope I explained myself correctly. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. And if you have any more ideas for future tutorials, please comment. I'll see you in the next video.